Welcome to the Housing Our Future webinar focused on affordable housing basics. My name is Kristen Baker. I'm the Executive Director of LISC Greater Cincinnati, and we're so happy you've joined us today to hear from our wonderful panel of housing experts to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of affordable housing finance, and to really, I think, get at the some of the really important issues that are being discussed right now in our community and what it means. So a few housekeeping items for you. First and foremost, you are all muted to minimize the noise, but please make use of the chat. We really would like to have a robust Q&A session after our presenters give their remarks, and you help us to do that. So please provide questions into the chat as speakers are presenting, and we will work through those in the Q&A section. The other item I will just mention is that each of these panelists is representing their own perspective and interests, and that disclaimer is just important for us to note, as we know there are some important issues coming forward in May on the Cincinnati primary ballot, so we just want to make that note as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it to our first presenter, Liz Blume, who is the director of the Community Building Institute at Xavier, who is going to step us through some of the data and some common language that is related to affordable housing that I think you all will find very useful. So, Liz.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, Kristen, and to everybody. I have the pleasure of sharing data with you today. Let's see here. And I want to say, I'm going to give you a little bit of history on the Community Building Institute's digging into this topic. I think probably 8 or 9 years ago, Cincinnati knows itself as a very affordable housing market, right? We know ourselves as a family-oriented affordable housing market. And in all the work that we were doing with the city, with the county, 7 or 8 years ago, we started to hear all this these anecdotal issues from our CDC partners, from our development partners, that affordability was becoming an issue. And the question in our mind was, well, like, how can that be, right? How is that possible? This is an affordable housing market. We all know it's an affordable housing market. And so how is it that we're having these affordability problems? And so we dug into the question. And what I'd like to do today quickly is spend a minute talking about what we think about when we're trying to research affordable housing topics. And I will tell you that there's been lots and lots of conversation about what affordable housing and housing research in general looks like. I'd like to actually say that I thought that there was a great article today by Dan Horn. I thought Becca Costello actually has contributed to this conversation. So for those of you who know all of this, I apologize. But what I want to do is just walk through some of the things that we try to understand when we're doing housing research. We want to understand the people who live in a place, and we want to understand the housing that's available to them. Now we want to figure out what the match is. That's principally what we're asking ourselves. So when I say understand the people in a place, I'm talking about household type. Is it a household of seniors? Are there children? Are there very young children? Are there singles? We really want to understand who lives in a place. And one of the really important parts of that, when you're trying to figure out how much housing somebody can afford, is how much income they make. I know that we've often talked about wages and the need to increase wages as part of this housing conversation. And this is why. If you have more income, you can buy more house or rent more house. And if your wages are very low, you have a very hard time finding housing. Race is also an issue. And I know we haven't really talked about that, but we have long history, not in just Cincinnati, but in this country, of discriminatory lending practices, discriminatory zoning policies, redlining, all kinds of urban renewal that disrupted neighborhoods. So it's important to understand how that impacts housing needs and the people who live in a place. So we understand the people who live in a place, and now we need to also understand the housing that's available. Much of the conversation in the last several weeks has been about rental housing, and we know that Cincinnati is a community that has a very high proportion of residents who rent their homes. We also need to think about owner-occupied housing. One of the things I think that a lot of communities are concerned about is making sure that longtime homeowners, particularly in communities where prices are appreciating quickly, don't lose their houses. We talk about rental problems as ending in a worst case scenario, which is an eviction. Homeowners lose their homes by foreclosure, and those things are both happening. So now I'm focused again on housing, right? We understand people, housing types, what kinds of people live in a house, what kind of income do they have to pay for their housing. The cost of housing is the other side of that equation, the cost of both rental housing and owner-occupied housing. And we also focused on the size of housing. It's difficult to suggest a family of 4 or a family of 6 needs to live in a 1-bedroom apartment. Doesn't meet their needs very well. So when we understand the people and we understand the housing, then we can understand what the match is or what the gap is in our case in Cincinnati. I want to talk a little bit, and for those of you who have become data wonks as a part of this conversation or who were before, I apologize, but I'm going to go through data sources a little bit just to give you a sense of what kinds of information we have to work with to understand the people who live in a place and understand the housing in a place. The US Census, which is what everybody's talking about, is sort of the gold standard of data that we have to understand who lives in a place and the kind of housing in a place, because once every 10 years, most recently in 2020, although we haven't seen those numbers yet, we count everybody and we count every unit. And so once every 10 years, we have very fresh, very current information. And then it gets old. And that's true from, we are now using the last 10-year census count was in 2010 until we can see our new 2020 numbers. So the census accommodate change in time, does a 1-year estimate, and then they produce a 3- and a 5-year estimate. What that means is that once a year, the census goes out and asks some sample of the people who live in a place, the same questions that they ask: what kind of household, how much money do you make, that sort of thing. And that is a way to refresh numbers. When we're looking at the metropolitan area, at the county, at the city, those numbers are probably fairly good. When we're looking at small geographies, like a single neighborhood or even a small community in Hamilton County, those numbers are less reliable because the chances that I'm going to hit somebody in West Price Hill or Deer Park or Addison on my 1-year estimate are much less than somebody in Hamilton County. And so we don't have as many data points in these estimates, which is why we use the 3- and 5-year estimates. I always need to watch Jeniece when I start having these conversations because I can feel I've gone too deep now. But that's the general sense of the census and why we use it. It's a very reliable data source. It becomes less so when the data is old. We use estimates to supplement, and they have limitations. There are a couple of other data sources I'd like to just talk about briefly. Our own auditors' files are a really good way to track owner-occupied home values. They're on a 3-year cycle. The data is available annually, and we often use it to double check. The MLS listings are also a great source. I actually want whoever is listening from the Inquirer, I greatly appreciate the annual reporting that you do on that. Their annual updates, and they too are focused on owner-occupied units and the value of homes that are for sale. Other supplemental data, a data source that we are more and more interested in is Zillow. Zillow tracks owner and renter values, and that's very helpful. It's live data, so it's updated much more frequently. These are both the MLS and then the auditors and the Zillow information are about housing units, not people. So we have to sort of supplement back and forth. HMDA data, or the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, lets us track lending practices. And then HUD data tracks subsidies and public housing available. That's where we know how many housing choice vouchers, which is sometimes called Section 8, are available. And I also want to bring up the point that we often do field survey work. And sometimes that is very labor intensive, but the best way to get a sense of what's going on in a particular community. Finally, I want to talk about some terms, and we've been talking about these terms in the region, and I think probably we all are getting a much better sense of what it means to say somebody is cost burdened. I need affordable housing. Everyone in the community should want affordable housing. Everybody needs to put their household finances together in a way that lets them pay for everything they need to pay for: school, healthcare, transportation, their car, food, the things their kids need, all of that sort of stuff. If we are spending more than 30% of our income on our housing, any of us, it gets harder to do all the other things we need to do. And so HUD has decided and determined for decades, we've been using this benchmark, that a stable household is one that doesn't have to spend more than 30% of their income on their housing. There's a second term, severe cost burden. And when we talk about severely cost burdened households, we know they're spending over 50% of their income on their housing. And what that means is you have less to do all of the other things that you need to do. So I always say affordable housing is something that every single household needs. And your ability to pay for your housing has to do with how much income your household has. When you don't have the funds to pay for housing, you are housing unstable. So housing instability, and I'm going to do this quickly. We often hear about the precarious position that households find themselves in if they're spending 30 or in some cases over 50% of their income on their housing. What that means is when there is the inevitable household emergency, the car breaks down, somebody gets sick, you have to move for some reason, those expenses overwhelm your budget. And certainly you're not doing the kind of saving that helps you protect against those things. That's what a housing stable household looks like. And because I know we talk about it and it sounds like mystery and magic, area median income, we talk often about providing housing relative to the area median income. Is this 120% of area median income? Is it 30%? What we're describing, area median income, is the midpoint of all the households in whatever geography you're studying, city, county, smaller jurisdiction, neighborhood, where half the people in the community make more than that number and half less. And so it essentially is the midpoint in income in the community. Right now in Cincinnati, it's $40,000 a year. In Hamilton County, it's $57,000 a year. And if you calculate back from that, what you understand is that people who are making a median income in Cincinnati can afford about $900 a month for their housing. In Hamilton County, people can afford about $1,400 a month for their housing. That means rent, that means mortgage, that means utilities, that means whatever your housing costs are. That just gives you a sense of it helps you peg where we all are in that region. And again, so half the population makes more than the area median income, half the population makes less than that. And maybe I will end my remarks here just with one final idea about this notion that Cincinnati is an affordable housing market. We are not San Francisco, we are not Boston, we are not New York. And so you can still buy a lot of housing value if you're making over $65,000 or $70,000 a year. If you're making less than that, it's very difficult because this is a rental market. There are a lot of people in the market. There's a lot of upward pressure on rents. There's a lot of upward pressure now, astounding upward pressure on home values. So for all of those reasons, it's helpful to understand sort of where income fits into the housing equation. So I apologize if I have gone too far here. This is a topic I liked way too much. I now have the pleasure of introducing Jeniece Jones to you. Jeniece is the Executive Director of Home, and they are the organization, Jeniece, 50 years old, a 50-year-old organization, I believe, who has been paying attention to housing patterns and to discrimination in this region for half a century. God, Jeniece, there you go.
Good morning, everyone. And so as soon as I get the access to the slide share, I'll throw up a couple of slides. Thank you to Lisk and Liz for inviting me to talk very briefly about the history of housing in Cincinnati. And from Home's perspective, we see the racial disparity as the as one of the core stories, that if you're talking about affordability, if you're talking about disparity, if you're talking about access to wealth and home ownership and protection from housing instability, then there's some historical patterns that are still with us. We have a legacy of these historical patterns that still make it important to talk about these issues, and also to take definitively strong, bold, assertive, disruptive steps to remedy them. So who is HOME? Real quickly, as Liz said, HOME is the fair housing organization here in the greater Cincinnati area. We have an enforcement group, which means folks call us all the time, every day, to tell us that they're being treated unfairly in their housing. And a lot of the things that Liz talked about in her discussion in terms of the broad picture and affordability is a lot of what we hear when folks call us. So this is how it translates into our day-to-day operations. You know, our housing specialists get calls from folks who, you know, are experiencing some of the housing tensions because, you know, it may be because, you know, this is the best housing they can afford, or, you know, they're worried about their housing because, you know, they're concerned that their children might be making too much noise, or, you know, they're concerned about getting in and out of their housing because they live in a really old building and they're having trouble on the steps, you know, and so they just got a diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis, and so now they're concerned, you know, like, okay, you know, I can afford this place, but where am I going to go? How am I going to find somewhere else that I can afford now that I have this disability? So we have our enforcement team that looks for legal discrimination in housing in particular. We have our tenant advocacy group that talks to folks who are having issues, landlord-tenant relations in particular. We're connected to a housing mediation service that tries to remedy those. We also work closely with some Priceville area schools to try to bring housing stability to families that, you know, but for affordability. In a lot of cases, you know, these kids are going to have their whole school year disrupted and move suddenly to another school in another jurisdiction, and, you know, possibly start over. And then we also offer direct housing stability assistance, you know, when we can. A lot of that's through private dollars that we do as direct rent assistance, because people call us with affordability issues, and we try to help with that. Education and outreach, we do a lot of that. We train, have courses for consumers as there are people looking to buy or rent housing, and we also do that for housing providers. And we also have native speakers on staff to talk to people who speak Spanish. So these are the protected classes under the Fair Housing Act. So you can see the ones for the national protections. You see the ones for Ohio, and then Cincinnati has several others on their books as well. So, you know, I want to spend, you know, the rest of my time, and I'll just say this, almost every slide I have here has a link to a more in-depth, robust study, as well as some resources at the end. So a lot of what I'm saying is not my opinion, necessarily my thoughts. Some of it is my opinion and my thoughts, but a lot of it is, you know, top line data that we have that's coming, you know, every which way, that's kind of landing on the same point in terms of the access to fair and affordable housing within our community. So if you go back to the redlining maps of the mid-1930s, and this is the only one that's on the Library of Congress site that I've been able to find, it shows, you know, that some neighborhoods were considered best, some neighborhoods were considered desirable, some were considered declining or hazardous. And those red lines, those mapping tools from the federal government and enforced by the banks and enforced by local governments came, you know, really segregated communities by race. So you know, if it was you know, hazardous or still definitely declining, were communities of Black and brown people, period. Those were communities with less investment, less opportunity to get home loans, less opportunity to get commercial loans, anything and everything that would take a community to thrive and, you know, outpace any type of issue that would have come up in the last 40, 50, 60 years, you know, was spelled out and drawn up by the federal government and enforced by state and local governments. So the legacy of redlining comes to Black home ownership first and foremost. So right now, white wealth is about 10 times of Black wealth, and that can be tracked directly to the history of redlining, not only in Cincinnati, but around the country. Zillow research that just came out a couple of days ago said, okay, so if it's around the country, Black-white wealth gap has widened over the past decade, according to this study they just put out a couple of days ago. And what they found, and was basically curated for us, was only 2 out of the 58 metropolitan areas studied in the research report had a larger gap in home ownership rates between Black and white than Cincinnati. So Cincinnati, in terms of the Black and white home ownership gap, according to this research, is 56 out of 58. So in the bottom 2. Legacy of redlining Black wealth. Again, a report by Gallup and Brookings a couple of years ago. Again, the link to the report is attached. Said the report found that a home in a majority Black neighborhood is likely to be valued at 23% less than the near identical home in majority white neighborhood. And then there was also a story that came out a few months ago about a mixed race couple, or an interracial couple, I should say, that when the Black wife was present and the pictures, the pictures of the Black people up on the family photos and everything was up, the home was valued at significantly less than when they took those photos down and her white friend stood in for her. And again, there's links to that information. Legacy of redlining, exclusionary zoning. So U.S. versus the Village of Arlington Heights. This is a U.S. Supreme Court from 1977. It's still on the books. That goes to the fact that, there's a statutory obligation for local jurisdictions to refrain from zoning policies that effectively foreclose on the construction of any low-cost housing within its corporate boundaries. So I think that that's a real clear question about if there's NIMBYism or hesitancy about where affordable housing should go. That's a history of redlining. And so jurisdictions have an affirmative responsibility to unwind that, and it's gone to the Supreme Court, and that Supreme Court matter still holds. So it's U.S. v. Village of Arlington Heights, Supreme Court, 1977. Legacy of redlining, eviction in Hamilton County. So again, there was an eviction study that came out a couple years ago that Home worked with UC and Legal Aid to produce, that found that the eviction rate was concentrated in a few areas along patterns of residential segregation. This goes back to those redlining maps. On average, predominantly Black neighborhoods are those with the highest eviction filing rates, while neighborhoods with few Black residents experience very few evictions. So again, that legacy of redlining carries us through home ownership, carries us through Black wealth, carries us through exclusionary zoning, and also carries us through eviction in terms of the legacy of redlining and racial disparities. Black home ownership as a roadmap. A few of us have worked on this. There are remedies that can be addressed to address Black home ownership in particular, affordable housing, other things. Very thoughtful people have thought out, what needs to be done to address these issues. And some of it is some very locally based opportunities to modify some policies, practices within our local jurisdictions could help dig into those numbers, help pull back those numbers. A real quick commentary about COVID-19 and fair housing. We see the disparities in COVID-19 around disability, race, and racial disparities, sex discrimination, and mass eviction. So if you look at the folks who were impacted by COVID and you layer that with the historical patterns of racial segregation in the history of redlining, and you layer that with COVID-19, you see there's a unique and pressing opportunity to use any Recovery Act dollars to address fair and affordable housing because it will help remedy the disparities, particularly with these groups. Housing trust funds, just a quick word about that. They exist in over 700 jurisdictions. They can be created by a number of different, creation documents. They need dedicated funding sources. And the local ballot initiative is a grassroots effort that over 200 volunteers and the folks that got involved with getting those signatures, the call was for racial equity and community oversight of elected officials. And here's some links to some of that. Liz will see a lot of the stuff she wrote on there and lists Housing Our Future is there, but there's some other stuff there too. The Zillow research is really great. The Data for Black Lives site is always very good. The Color of Law, The Forgotten History of How the Government Segregated America is a great resource as well. But again, I always want to make sure that there are links to everything I put within the presentation, but then also there's another slide of other further research if you want to get deep into the numbers. And then if you feel like you're experiencing unfair treatment related to your housing, you can always call home 721-4663. And thank you. And with that, I will turn it over to Bobby from Maly.
Good morning. Well, thank you. Thanks, Jeniece. Can you guys hear me okay? Great. Well, my name is Bobby Maly, and I'm the CEO of the Maly Group. Our mission is to positively transform communities. So for us, we do that in a couple ways: urban revitalization in Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, doing it in places like Fort Wayne, Columbus, Dayton, recently the Dayton Arcade, and neighborhoods in Cincinnati like Walnut Hills and Over the Rhine. We also, part of our mission, accomplishing our mission, is to partner with affordable housing owners and providers, managers who need some help trying to figure out how to provide that housing. And so we really help create that high impact affordable housing with our partners locally, like Episcopal Retirement Services, Talbot House, Lighthouse Youth Services, Cincinnati Union Bethel. And because it's messy, and a lot of times the core business is not figuring out complex financing, which we'll look at in a minute. And I think, we always liked it when we're talking about affordable housing. We always believe that affordable housing can be a part of our economic revitalization strategies and our economic development strategies if it's indistinguishable from market rate, or in a lot of cases better than the market rate. And I think we've seen that in a number of neighborhoods in Cincinnati where that can play out. And so I think affordable housing is important, number one, because of the crisis that Liz and Jeniece talked about for the people. It's also important as an economic development strategy. And so I think that's important to keep in mind as we talk about trust funds and sources and what's good and healthy for neighborhoods. In a minute, I want to show, I'm going to pull up a spreadsheet and just kind of go through that with you guys, because I think that really is kind of where the rubber hits the road and figuring out what is the real problem in figuring out how to solve our affordable housing gap. But I think before I do that, I really appreciate what Liz and Lisk have done in setting the table for the conversation around affordable housing, because I think the most difficult thing is, what does it mean? The word triggers so many different responses. I think Liz talked about Cincinnati nationally is a relatively more affordable than places like San Francisco. That's a very different thing than if you're on the west side of town and you hear affordable housing and you think Section 8 because you believe your neighborhood has an over concentration of Section 8 housing in your neighborhood, and that triggers a very different response. And some people want housing that is rent restricted to protect against gentrification and pushing out long-time lower income community members. So the gentrification component of affordable housing is I think a lot of times what people mean. And some of us just want to make sure we have housing that's affordable for our workforce. And so there's a real concern. I think Portland is a city that doesn't use any money to subsidize market rate housing in their city. They use all their subsidy for affordable housing because they need to make sure they have housing for their workforce in their urban core, so they can keep the company. So I think, to me, it's just a very complex conversation. It's really not a black and white situation. It's very complex. And so I like what LISC and CBI have done in thinking about, let's talk about our workforce who spends more than 30% of their income on housing. I think that's the right way to think about it. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I want to share with you a sample project. So I think a lot of times we talk about this is a math problem. Liz, can you see my Excel sheet? Okay, great. So I just want to go through a project with you guys, and then if you do have questions and you want to ask, or we can play with this later on if we have time. It really is a math problem. If you buy a 4-family and you have a mortgage, you sized your personal cash payment and your mortgage you borrowed on that 4-family based on the rent that you can get from the other 3 apartments. If you lower the rent, now you can't pay your mortgage or other bills. It's really not that more. That's really the bottom line when you look at it, whether it's a 4-family or 111 units. And so, I think one of the things I want to show you here in a second is that debt and equity are really part of the same problem statement. A bank and an investor will give a developer money only when they believe they will get it back with a rate of return. It's an interest rate on your debt, just the same way you have on your house. And it's a target internal rate of return, an IRR, or a cash on cash return for an investor. You're not going to get those dollars from either a bank or an investor if you're not able to deliver that return. And so, so let's look at that. In construction costs and development costs are relatively constant. Now, in a lot of affordable housing, we may not be putting granite countertops necessarily. We believe that it should be indistinguishable in quality from the outside, so that if you're looking at a building, you should not know whether it's somebody, what kind of income they make who live there. But the variable really will be in the rents. And so let's look at that. So this is a project. This is just a generic project. It's 111 units. And in my capital stack here, highlighting, you can see it's a relatively straightforward project. This happens to be a historic building. We love historic buildings. So this is a historic building. And in this project, I've got 111 units. I have a first mortgage of, let's see, the $20 million project. You can see in my construction costs, development fee, all the normal stuff with architecture, appraisal, legal, et cetera. It's a $20 million cost. So we start with that. Well, then I have to go and say, how much money can I borrow? Well, let me start with, actually, you know what this is? Yeah, it is historic. So I've got $2.4 million of historic tax credit equity. This happens to be a historic building. And so I qualify for federal historic. It's not a competitive source. And so I'm trying to go with a sort of a vanilla-ish project here to give you a good visual of what happens when we play with the rents. The first mortgage, I want to see what I can attract. I can attract $14.5 million of debt. And right now I've got owner equity. That could be an investor or owner developer of $2.8 million. So when I look at this, let's look at the operating agreement to make sure that things balance. My debt coverage ratio is 1.2. That's about the bare minimum that I can't really go any lower than that. I have to cover my debt payments with cash of at least a ratio of 1.2. I know we've got some bankers in the group. They will agree with me on that. The next thing is the cash on cash return. So I'm looking at the investor. The two pieces are the debt and equity. An investor is not going to take less probably than a 5% cash on cash return. That's the bare minimum. And so I'm barely meeting that threshold. In other words, in year 2, $168,000 is 5.9% of the 2.8 million they put into the project. If they're not going to get that return, they'll just go put it somewhere else. They'll put it in the stock market. They'll put it in another business. They'll put it somewhere else that meets their return demands. And so I've got revenue coming in of 1.6. My operating costs are $530,000. After I pay my mortgage and my minimum return, I have no cash left. So so that deal barely works, and it works on its own. I don't have any public subsidy in there other than the historic credits. But let's see what happens when we say, all right, oh, and by the way, my rents are $950. That's a 1-bedroom. My rents are $950. So that's a market rent in this project that I'm doing in downtown Cincinnati. All right, well, let's go and say, all right, $950 is not affordable to somebody making 60% of area median income. It is not affordable to somebody making 50% of area median income. So let's just pick a 50%, somebody who makes 50% of the area median income. They're making $30,520 a year. Affordable rent for them, when I take out utilities, is $663 a month. So if I want to make this project apples to apples affordable for 111 people at $663, I have to make the rent $663 a month. So let's do that. I'm going to go back to my rent, type in 663. Let's see what happens. Well, my revenue, as you saw, went way down. And now I have a debt coverage ratio of below 1. I'm underwater. I'm certainly not giving any cash back to my investor. So I have to go back to my sources, and now I cannot support as much debt. So let's plug in $11 million instead of 14.5. I've played with this enough. It's like that, cooking show. I know that's the right number. Normally I would have to spend some time figuring out what it can support, but I can, at $11 million, I've created a $3.3 million hole in my budget, but I am back to a debt coverage. And look at this. So my revenue went down quite a bit. My costs was $530,000. They went down to, my operating costs didn't change very much. That's probably a function mostly of a management fee that is fluctuating as a percentage of the revenue. My operating costs went down it didn't move much. My revenue went down significantly more at a greater pace. And so that's what's causing this problem. And so now I have a debt coverage ratio that barely meets it. I'm barely over that 5% threshold to meet my investors' demands. And I have a deal that is right on the line and works. But I have a deal that has a $3.3 million hole in it. And so this is really the problem that we see when we, when we're talking about affordable housing and why it costs so much money to do it. Now, the one thing I will say, and I'll show you one more example, is that whether the number is 28,000 or whatever the number is, it's a significant number. I think that 28,000 is also not black and white. It's a spectrum. There's a spectrum of affordability needs along that 28,000. And so I think what's important, one of the reasons I like the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, just in general, I'm not talking about the ballot issue here. I'm talking about the mechanism of a trust fund managed by someone that can make loans like a LISC or a CDF, is because every project is very different, and we need to be able to be flexible because there are lots of different kinds of affordable housing. If you can imagine, based on what happens here, if I tried to make this rent affordable at 30% of area median income, right? My rents are now $386. It's a massive number. Well, if that could be a permanent supportive housing project. What if I want to make it affordable at 60% of area median income, or 80% of area median income? The dollars can go a lot further. The gap will be significantly less when you're addressing the upper end of that spectrum or that range of affordability. So we can solve, it's a lot easier to solve that than it is, permanent supportive housing, for example. These folks cannot, they may not have income. or very little income. And so the tax credit program is primarily the best source for a project like that. Let me just show you real quick, going from 50% to 60%, if I plug in rents at 872 instead of 663, let me just show you what happens to my gap. So it was a $3.3 million hole. I think my debt, I believe I can support 13.5 million. My gap is around $1 million if I go check. Again, I've done this a couple of times, so you can see I'm really back at that bare minimum threshold. But just by bumping it from 50 to 60%, my gap has gone from 3.3 to $1 million. I just show you that because, when people try to reduce this complex conversation to a very simplistic, well, how many units can you produce for that amount of money? Well, how many, you can't do that. That's a false dichotomy of affordable or not affordable. It's really it's a spectrum of affordability. And that's why I love the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, because we have to have flexibility to solve affordability along those lines. If I took that to 80%, the gap would go even further down. Now the need is greater at the lower end. And so I'm not trying to pretend like it's, that, hey, great news, we can solve this much easier by just doing all 60% units. But I do think it's important that we keep that flexibility and the shades of gray in mind as we're talking about affordable housing. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So I think the last thing, and then I'll turn it over, is okay, so what sources are there? I think there really aren't a lot. We end up with a lot of these, like, sometimes a barbell effect of very, very high income or luxury apartments or very low income, because there are tools to do very low income, albeit very competitive and difficult. So you end up a lot of times with market rate. Certainly in places like over the Rhine, you have very high income and you have very low income, but oftentimes it's very difficult to do something in the middle, because the sources of funds that create new affordable housing are very limited. You're basically talking about a tax credit program, the low-income housing tax credit program. There's a 9% and a 4%. The 9% is highly competitive. Every year, developers compete across the state. It is significantly oversubscribed, but it generates quite a bit more of tax credits that can subsidize and fill that gap. The 4% credit is not a competitive credit, but it is, as it sounds, it didn't used to be 4%, but great news, now the 4% credit is 4%. It is 4/9 of value, essentially, of the 9%. And so if you're trying to develop new housing or renovate and preserve housing that is affordable at those lower levels, very quickly, it can be very difficult to accomplish that. The additional other funding sources are, dollars that typically come from federal pass-throughs, so home funds, CDBG funds. Every city, certainly the city of Cincinnati is no exception, has very limited funds, and so they'll typically do they call it a NOFA process, notice of a funding availability. They might award, we're talking like, maybe $1 million or $1.5 million kind of dollars of sums to be able to fund a few different projects. They are gap funds. They are not going to create new units on their own, typically, unless you're trying to create affordable units at the 60 to 80% sort of workforce level. The other sources would be more localized, city capital. I think in my 17 years at Model, I've seen city put capital dollars, maybe, I think David Mann put in $2 million a couple of years ago, and that's the only time I can remember that happening. Tip dollars, very possible, but a little bit more complicated. And then, people talk about tax abatement a lot. Tax abatement is important, But all the tax abatement does is generate, it lowers your expenses, which will increase your ability to borrow more debt or attract more equity. So it's not a direct source, but I think it is an effective tool to help generate this. Just so you know, this project, the market rate deal needed tax abatement. I had already assumed tax abatement in the project that I showed you because it's hard to get a lot of market rate deals done in our downtown because our rents are $1.60, $1.80 a foot versus, if you go to Boston, they might be $3.50, $3.80 a foot. And so when you have lower rents, because we're relatively affordable to places like San Francisco, it's a lot harder to get the market rate deals done. If it's hard to get a market rate deal done, then the ripple effect and on getting a high quality, affordable housing project that is indistinguishable from market rate and helps generate, that neighborhood revitalization or is a really great asset in our neighborhood is quite difficult. So I think that was what I was asked to talk about, to just really give you an overview of the math problem as it relates to affordable housing and why all these conversations we're having are so difficult. And maybe a quick overview of the sources. I'm happy to answer any specific questions when we get to that point. Kristen or Callie, I think I'm turning it to Robert. Robert, are you next?
I'm next.
Okay, Robert Killins, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Bobby. Let me just say the views that I'm about to express are my views. They're not the views of Greater Cincinnati Foundation, where I work, or any other organization. They're just my personal views about which I'm very passionate. And so I'm just excited and thrilled that we've had 3 extremely competent professionals talk to us so far about different aspects of this housing affordability issue. And I just want to continue to reiterate and amplify what Bobby just mentioned. It is very complex. There's no silver bullet. There's no one solution. We have to use all of our tools in the toolkit, all of the recommendations that were put forth in the Housing Our Future study and in other similar plans. But I want to talk to you about 3 things today, and I'll try to be brief. I want to talk to you about education, imagination, and then activation. Education. We need to continue to educate ourselves, and I want to thank LISC because this is one of several forums they've had. We've had several at the Greater Cincinnati Foundation to educate our donors and friends, and there have been others throughout this time. We need to learn more about this issue because it is very complex. Housing is, and affordable housing in particular, is a social determinant of so many things in our lives that we often don't think about. Education, where you live, and if you have stable housing, makes a big difference. Your health and the kind of health care you get, the economic mobility and economic opportunities that we get. So I want to talk just briefly about one link that we seldom think about or hear about, and that is the link between affordable housing, or should I say the lack of affordable housing and the instability that it creates for young children going to school. We have a problem in our city of student mobility. And this is a program, Jeniece talked about a ton of great things that their organization works on. When she alluded to programs in Price Hill, this is one that they've been working on for many years. Because we have 10%, more than 3,000, the numbers in excess of 3,000 homeless students in our community. But our education and school success is based on taking a test. But if half the students who start in a school are not there at the end of the year, but guess what? They're tested and required to know the information. And because school curriculums aren't synced across schools and school districts, many of our students have gaps in what they've learned, but they are tested on a finite amount of information. They're not tested on just what they learned, they're tested on what they should have learned. And so when we see low performing schools, especially in our low income neighborhoods, one thing we seldom link this to is the student mobility related to the lack of affordable housing, related to evictions. So that's one area, and there are many related to health and other economic opportunities that we need to educate ourselves on. So I'm asking everybody on this webinar today, no matter what your profession, please do more to educate yourself about all of these social determinants. The second thing is I want to ask you now to use your imagination for just a little bit. What if our city wasn't in the news for its high child poverty rates? And what if in our city, 75% of African American children weren't growing up in poverty? What if, according to the All In Cincinnati report, a report funded by the All In Cincinnati Collaborative, which is a partnership between Greater Cincinnati Foundation, United Way, and Interact for Health, a study funded through and completed by Policy Link. It said that if within our local economy, our region, if we were to eliminate disparities based on income and gender, that our local economy would be $9.9 billion larger. Wow. What would a $9.9 billion, and what would an economy that was $9.9 billion larger create? It would create more economic opportunity for all of us, more jobs, more spending, more savings, and even more taxes. More taxes for school districts and cities and counties. So there's a dimension to this problem, and Jeniece highlighted it. This problem of affordability of affordable housing is not one that touches us all equally. It's disproportionately impacting our low-income residents and also our people of color, African Americans in particular, because of the demographics of our region. So it is indirectly also an issue of racial justice, and one that we've not been doing the best job to address. And finally, activation. Based on what you've heard, it's time for all of us to become advocates for more housing that is affordable. For more housing that is affordable. If you're a business owner, you should advocate because you want stable workforce. You want your employees to not be living paycheck to paycheck, and you want them to have stable, quality, affordable housing that will create a stable workforce. If you care about education and you're an educator, you will want to have children be able to concentrate and to succeed, and to start a school year and end that same school year in the same school and not be in 2 or 3 different school districts due to no fault of their own as children. But that loss of education creates a ripple effect. If you're a healthcare advocate, you want quality housing so that you don't see the same children showing up at Children's Hospital for asthma that's caused by the lack of caused by mold and rodent feces and other things that trigger asthma, so that they cycle through and through and through and it doesn't happen. If you're advocates for children or for seniors, you want seniors to have safe, affordable, quality housing where they can live their lives in comfort. So again, I hope that you'll do the 3 things that I've encouraged you to do. One is that you'll educate yourself on all of the dimensions of this varied and complex issue. Two, that you'll use some imagination and see what if we had the will, the community will to invest millions of dollars and not look at it simply as a cost, but as an investment that would create a better community for ourselves so that Cincinnati would not be at the bottom of the list like the ones Jeniece mentioned and others too often, or at the top of the wrong list for child poverty, but that we would be that city for everyone that was a great city. And then finally, no matter what angle you're coming from, let's all get active and encourage our elected officials, our friends, our neighbors to care about this issue in a different way. Because not only will it be good for the people impacted, we will get a benefit of living in a better city, a more inclusive city, and a more prosperous city. Thank you. I'll turn it now back over to Kristen.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you to all of our panelists. This was really rich information. I know it's a lot to digest if you are newer to this topic, but we hope that this was useful to you. And we've received some really great questions in the chat, so I'd like to get to as many of those as we can. So I'm going to quickly sift through. I'm going to ask our panelists to answer, and there's a couple we can probably be sort of brief on. So we'll get right to it. So this question I'm going to say a word about it, and then I'm going to turn to Liz. We have a question about the percent of our total market that is rental versus home ownership, and how does that compare to similar cities? So actually, the Inquirer story that we talked about at the top of the hour here gets at this in a really great way, and I think we'll send that out to you as soon as we can. But Liz, do you want to say a word about what we saw in that data set?
Yeah, I mean, they're citing around 60% of our residents are renters. We've been consistently in that range for decades. We're a relatively, we have a significantly high proportion of renters. Partly it's because of density, and we live in communities on hillsides, and we have some kind of constraints, but it's just been the tradition in this community, and it's been that kind of persistently high for a very long time.
Great, thanks. Okay, we have a question about zoning. So I think actually it would be great to hear from maybe Jeniece. Well, Liz, I know you have a strong background in this too, and Bobby, I'm curious about your perspective as well as from the developer side. So what does our zoning look like now in the county, right? So I do want to zoom out and make sure we're talking about both the city of Cincinnati and our entire county footprint. And then what changes might be useful to help increase affordability in this community with respect to zoning. So Jeniece, do you want to say a word first?
Yeah, I mean, so I was on the steering committee for zoning for Housing Our Future, and so it's inclusionary zoning, right? It's zoning that seeks to include and not exclude, and that might be greater density, that might be linkage fees, that could be any number of things that creates opportunity in areas of opportunity for people to have affordable housing. And I know Liz has the map, so I'll turn it to her for there.
Yeah, just maybe a couple of more things I would add. Significant parts of Hamilton County, and actually significant parts of the city of Cincinnati, are zoned for relatively low density single family housing. And what that does is make it hard to develop more affordable housing. And I want to say a word. When we talk about density, I think immediately people's heads go to 10-story buildings. And that is not what's appropriate in most communities. And it's not what it would take to make the community more welcoming for affordable housing. I think there are all kinds of interim steps. For example, we ought to be allowing accessory dwelling units in all single family zones. That means your elderly parents or your not quite launched kids, says the mom with 20 somethings, can live with you and not be underfoot. I think Cincinnati and Hamilton County are full of 2 and 3 and 4 and up to 10 unit buildings that could provide great affordable housing, and many of them are not. So, and now I go too far. Many of them are not conforming uses or are not consistent with zoning. which makes it harder to get funding to do redevelopment on them, and it makes it harder to occupy them if they've been vacant. We ought to respect that building type. It's part of our legacy. We ought to invest in those kind of units. I think that in corridors all along neighborhoods in the city and the county, along Reading Road, along Hamilton, along Harrison, along Fenway, along Madison, we're all very interested in supporting our local business districts. One of the ways to do that is to add more people to the coffee shop market in those districts. And one of the ways to do that along those corridors is to add some bigger buildings, the kind of buildings that Bobby is talking about when he shows you his spreadsheet. That makes what's going on in College Hill right now. That makes perfect sense, and it supports business districts. So there's all kinds of things we can do. And I want to, before I stop talking, I'm sorry, just link to one thing that Jeniece said. Density by itself does not assure affordability. We need to make sure that when we're giving density bonuses or when we're increasing density, that we're requiring some level of affordability.
Bobby, do you want to say anything about the impact of zoning on your?
Well, I think, I think what the previous two folks said is right. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion in a place like over the Rhine where it's, trying to reduce density. That is not the friend of affordable housing. It's not going to create affordable housing, but it certainly provides another roadblock, which we don't need. And so I think they did a good job. I would point to that as number one with a bullet.
Kristen, I'm sorry, can I say one more thing too? I think one of the things that developers experience, as I'm thinking, as Bobby's talking, is it can be really difficult to get a project approved when you're bringing a project to the table and asking for rezoning. I would ask communities in Hamilton County and neighborhoods in Cincinnati to think about actively doing rezoning before a project comes to the table so that you don't put that burden on a developer. Makes projects much easier to do. And I think that way communities can zone where they want and sort of take that into their own hands and reduce that burden on a developer.
Great, thank you. I'm going to look to Bobby again on this one because we have a couple questions I'm going to combine into one. One part of this is all about low-income housing tax credits. And so what could we do to improve our region's success in obtaining those credits? And then also, how does the trust fund, regardless of how it ultimately ends up being funded, but how does the trust fund funding sort of fit with that? You touched on it a little bit, but I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more around some of these mechanisms and the tools and why we're maybe falling a little bit behind our other peer cities in the state.
Good news, bad news. I've looked at the data over the last 20 years. We are not behind our other cities, and we are pro rata on target. If you look at it from a population perspective, Cincinnati is not losing out. I've heard that a number of times. It's just not true. So, that's the good news, and the bad news is we are where we are. I don't think that's a source to move the needle. So to me, there is one thing though, I think that's important. Number one, the 4% credit that I mentioned just went from 3%. It locked it. It's been floating for years, and that rate has been around 3%. It just bumped to 4% in December. That's a big deal. So I'm working on the Alexander project, trying to preserve that building. There's a lot of structural issues, a lot of decks, a lot of exterior costs. Just to give you a sense on that project, going from a 3% to a 4% rate creates about $1 million in gap subsidy just with that congressional move. So that's a big deal. That will help see more 4% bond deals, which is not competitive and can really allow us to move the needle. The second thing I would mention is that I happen to be chairing the Ohio Housing Council right now. It's my turn. And the thing I wanted to do with my time is to try to create a state credit. And you will be hearing a lot about that this year. We will be introducing a bill for the first time at the Ohio State Legislature. There are almost 20 states in the country who already have a state tax credit program. And what these states are doing is pairing the state credit with their 4% tax credits and basically doubling their production. And so we're talking about another 22 to 2,300 units per year in the state, many of which would come to Cincinnati. So that's going to be a very, very big deal. I think a lot more will be coming out on that in the next 2 months. It will be introduced this session. And so that's a big deal. Kristen, I think that's the bad news. And then I think there is some good news. I think Ohio is a big state, and we should not be in the lower half of the 50 states that have our own state credit program.
Thanks. That's helpful insight, Bobby. There's a question here that I think I will quickly field, and that's about resources. We have, so certainly model group is of a size and scale that requires a certain kind and type of investment from groups like us, which are community development financial institutions and banks, et cetera. But then what sources are available for small developers, and folks that are looking at sort of doing 5 to 20 unit affordable housing developments? And that's an important question too, right? Because we know that is also going to help us bring more units online that are meeting needs. So I would say too that LISC is a source that can work with those kinds of developers as well. Yes, we have skewed towards sort of larger scale projects in the past, but I would encourage, if you work with a small developer, send them to us. We can help them find the way. Also, Cincinnati Development Fund, they're on this call. They've been seeded with resources from Greater Cincinnati Foundation. That's another place to start. And, we really just want to help these projects get done, whether they get financing from us or not. And I think CDF is probably in a similar boat. So we really want to try and help support. We view this as economic development as well, right? If we're supporting particularly Black-owned firms and developers that are sort of just getting their feet underneath them in this market, that's something that's of really high value to us. So I don't know, Robert, if you want to say anything else about that from the GCF.
No, Kristen,
All right.
You hit it. I think the small contribution that we saw was the opportunity to do in partnership with CDF was to make pre-development resources more affordable, especially for small developers. When you've got to spend a couple of $100,000 at the front end to prove and to show that your project is viable, based on architectural and environmental and tax credit applications, all of that stuff, and make all those investments, that can be difficult. So that's where we are excited to try to leverage the little bit, and doing it with a well-established partner like CDF just made all the sense in the world to us. So
thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right, we've got a few more minutes, a couple more questions I'm going to get in here. This is an interesting one that I'm going to look, I think Robert and Jeniece, maybe you might want to be the ones to take the first swing. Should new affordable housing units be concentrated in predominantly lower income neighborhoods, or should they be placed in a variety of neighborhoods to build socioeconomically diverse neighborhoods? And I would encourage you to think countywide also in your response, right? Because we are not an island here in the city of Cincinnati. So Jeniece, do you want to respond first?
I think it's important to make every community an opportunity community as much as you can. So I would say if there's new development coming into a traditionally Black neighborhood, low to moderate income neighborhood, I say you build first. So don't say, we're going to have these units for y'all on the back end, just hang tight with us, you'll get these units. I say no. If it's an area that's been historically gentrified or seen racial segregation or a legacy of redlining, build first, and then also use one of Liz's fantastic maps to go out and look to see where there are opportunity neighborhoods where it makes sense to do those investments, and those have to be looked at a little differently. So I always say, no one's saying people have to be shoehorned out of their neighborhood that they lived in because there's a concentration. My belief is that, the investments should go where the people are and make every community a community of opportunity, make every zip code, predictive of health, wealth, education, environmental sustainability, employment, transportation, so build out where people are. And I think, if you do that, then it attracts people moving in, as well as having those assets out in the county attracts people deciding maybe they want to move out. So I think desegregation kind of happens when it's intentional on both sides, regardless of where the community is right now.
Yeah, I said it, it really depends. When you think about, I'm a student a little bit of sociologist William Julius Wilson and Robert Sampson, and they've written books about, when work disappears and the truly disadvantaged and all of those, and they've studied this issue. So it's, in some cases, it makes sense, based on a lot of the factors that Jeniece just mentioned, to build units in places where people have a social safety net and a social network. So so if you are low income, you don't have transportation, a very good, reliable transportation, your children are in schools in a place, etc., and then you are uprooted and sent because you have a nicer opportunity to live across town, but then you don't have access to get to work or to get your children back to school or to daycare or to childcare. You see, so then you've created a burden. And what those sociologists have said is that it can happen to build places, and move people, but you want to make sure that we do, and which we seldom do, is that we plan it in a way to build a safety net around those people so that after a year or two, they haven't left on their own or been evicted and migrate back to some other state of homelessness. So I think it very much depends. And we have a number of neighborhoods, and I'll just talk about the West End, where we lost tremendous population with Hope 6, that, depopulated, people went other places, and people live across the town and across the county. If given the opportunity, many of them, to return to a neighborhood like that with the right conditions, they would. And so the question is always, it depends. But we need to really, if we're going to move to make sure we establish housing in places where it hasn't been, that we are thoughtful and we're collaborative and that they're welcomed and that we don't put people in hostile new situations for the sake of believing that we've done something that's going to make a difference long term, and it may not. So sorry if that was a little long-winded, but I was trying to get context for the answer. Yeah.
And Kristen, maybe if I could just jump on, and I think I want to say what Robert is saying in a little bit different way. It's a false choice. We should be doing all of those things. We should be looking to do housing in all of those neighborhoods, because the ultimate objective is that everybody has the choices, that has the broadest number of choices, so that they can make decisions in ways that work best for their families. That's what we should be getting to. It's not one or the other. It's all of the above.
Great.
Thanks, Liz.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Liz. And I think that's a great spot to end. We're at 11:15, and we have a few more questions that we didn't get to, but I hope that this was informative for you all and useful. And please reach out to us if you have other topics you'd like us to cover in these future webinars. We're always looking to understand what folks want to know and how can we bring that education to the community. So please contact us. And again, thank you to our wonderful panel. This was a really great conversation today. We could probably go on for another couple hours, but we won't. So we appreciate you, and thanks for joining us today. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.